Hi, Dr. Adrienne Lemon from somewhere not in the sweltering heat of the East Coast. Where do I find you?
Hi, I am in Paris, France right now.
Bonsoir, right? It's
Yes,
after, it's later.
yes.
Aren't you? That don't ask. That's it. That's it. Je ne parle pas français. That's it. How long have you been in Paris?
I've been here for 3 years. Before that, I was in, Brussels and Africa before that, so
But you are born and raised.
in the US, I was born in Florida, and grew up in South Carolina, and, it's been about 15 years since I've lived there, but yeah, that's where I'm from.
Do you think you'll ever come back home?
Maybe. Yeah, so my partner is French, so we're stuck we're here for a bit and then we'll see. Life is long, so
Yeah. Well, you're
but we
certainly
probably
not going back to Florida or South Carolina in the middle of July or August.
not now, yeah. A little
Yeah.
too hot right now.
Yeah, no, I don't blame you. All right, well, let's jump in really quick. Thank you so much for being here. This is Dr. Adrienne Lemon. Dr. Adrienne Lemon is a crucial team member at Search for Common Ground, an organization that we've lifted up a lot here on Land Event and will continue to do so. And Adrienne is the Senior Director for Strategy at Search, which admittedly, Adrienne is sort of like unclear what that actually means. And having spent a little bit of time with your bio and your expertise, I actually think if anyone described what it is that you do, it can be difficult because I think what you are trying to do is extraordinarily difficult, which is if I'm going to attempt to summarize it, Search for Common Ground, an organization that's been around for 3 decades. I think it's one of the most important peacebuilding organizations on the planet. They're credited with preventing genocide in Burundi, of which Adrienne is an expert on that particular subject. But I would also credit that in many other places around the world. And they're just a very, very large bug just fell out of the sky on my desk. The largest ant I've ever seen just fell from the ceiling onto my desk. And good luck to your life, but I have no idea where that came from. Um, it's like jarring to me. I don't know where this thing came from. I am like in the most central part of this whole entire house. Okay. Anyway, um, East Timor, Myanmar, they now have programs in the States. Sri Lanka, it was under their wings that uh, less bloodshed was spilled. I would say that Search for Common Ground is focused on trying to build peace and prevent violence. And how does one articulate what that is, how you measure it, whether or not it's successful? And I think you have one of the more impossible jobs in trying to articulate and quantify what that actually means. But in the state of the world today, when everybody seems to have a position on definitions, and I'm specifically referencing the word genocide, I don't even think people know where the ICC is. I don't even know if they know what the Hague is, but like everybody is like, well, let's talk about conventions and things like that. Like it's a world I love, but the world seems to just be showing up to it. It's a world that you know with great granularity. How are you processing what's happening around you and in your field?
Ooh, that's a big question. I've been no, I would say especially this year, it's been really hard. Um, and I think, one of the things that you learn in doing this work is to be capable of processing all of the immense challenges of different conflicts that are happening around the world. And I tend to be one of those people that, like, when there's a crisis, it's, ABC, let's go, let's do this, let's do that, let's try this. If it fails, we go to the next thing.
Mhm.
Um, but when the whole ecosystem around you is sort of crashing down as well, and you see so many things sort of tumbling at once, not just on a specific situation or conflict setting, but globally, yeah, that's been very challenging this year. But we're trying, we continue to kind of try to be creative and think about what could
Yeah.
be next.
Right. Stamina and perseverance look different in 2025 than it did in 2022. And I'm going to read between the lines that you're not just referencing um, uh, emerging conflict in the Middle East, but specifically USAID being cut and the reorganization of global aid and peacekeeping and peace building. I'm assuming that's what you're
Mhm.
referencing.
Yeah, for me, I think also you kind of mentioned like my job is to look at the signs and read the tea leaves a little bit. So many of the things that are emerging now or appear to be emerging now are not, unfortunately, not entirely surprising. But yeah, you kind of find a way to get something done and then another door closes. You find a way to come up with another idea and another door closes. And I think that's also a different kind of stamina. Many of our teams, face that around the world. But it's interesting to be in a moment where, everyone is really facing it all at once and it's hard to find some of the bright spots. So that's been, an interesting challenge of this year that maybe makes it a little more unique than years past.
When you say reading the tea leaves is like July 29th, 2025, are the tea leaves different than they were 3 months ago, 6 months ago, 16 years ago? Like how are you I know you've done so much work on identity,
Yeah.
particularly on age and gender, class in Burundi, and I want to hear if you wouldn't mind answering this question as you summarize your work there too. But does it seem like the best practices or the patterns that you've seen over the past number of decades in emerging conflict and post conflict are still applicable today, or is it a totally different landscape?
No, they are still applicable, and maybe that's what I mean when I say that it's been kind of hard this year is that when I look at the context of polarization in the United States, or I look at a situation like Israel and Palestine, what's happening there, um, there are signs that come before the most catastrophic moments. And so when you talk about January 29th, pre and post, the situation is very different. But Search was actually talking about the challenges that were about to come in the year, 2 years prior to that, kind of saying, "There's increasing polarization, we need to be paying attention to this. It is going to have a real effect on the way we think about, conflict, the way we're prepared to deal with conflict." And so that's kind of what I mean when I say reading the tea leaves. It's not that it was a total shock that it was coming. Of course, I don't think anybody knew exactly what was coming. But a lot of these things, you can start to see the signs and say, "Okay, something needs to change." And yeah, in terms of whether our toolkit, still applies, I actually think quite a lot of it does. The challenge now is whether people believe that that's the right set of tools for the challenges that they see now. So we start to see, not just the United States, but also countries in Europe. Everyone's sort of increasing their budgets around funding for war and preparation for that, around defense, et cetera, and sort of shows a shift in the buy-in. Where's the buy-in and what we need to be investing in right now? And it shows a lot of fear actually of what's to come. So that is, that's changing. That doesn't mean that the tools don't work. You know, what people choose to invest in certain moments and in a certain context doesn't really negate the value of the tools. If anything, I think it's the opposite, that some of these tools are needed now more than
Yeah.
ever.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay. So if we assume that there's people who are watching who have very literal zero context of what it is that you're saying, can we start naming some of the can we define what polarization means? You mentioned that Search had been raising red flags around seeing it. What was the it? Are you referencing the polarization in the United States? Are you talking about Israel, Gaza? What are some of the other conflicts around the world that you all are pointing a spotlight on, saying that looks like it's about to pop off. We don't have to spend too much time on the US because Nia Lynn, one of your phenomenal colleagues, is going to be on later this week or next week. But can you help us understand what some of the theories are, or what some of the signs are that you all have been seeing leading into this moment over the past 5 years, 10 years, 15 years that helps us also look for it in the
Sure.
whatever's about to happen?
So the difference in how we talk about these things is a kind of polarization, which isn't always used in everyday conversation, is that we look for a lot of the dynamics that are relational and that tell us whether people are ready or capable or confident to live together in one society or not. Let's put it that way.
Okay, so are people confident to live together? What does that mean?
So we use a few signs to look at that. One is how people experience violence itself. Do they feel safe? Have we seen signs that there are more attacks on people or something physical that is direct
And
for
you're
a person?
talking about, like, violence against people from, like, street violence or, like, drunk drivers or, like, domestic violence?
Great question. Let's put a few boundaries on it. So we
Great.
wouldn't put, something like drunk drivers in that category, probably, unless that specifically meant that somebody was going to fear another group of people, right? So if
Okay.
I say, "Okay, I fear drunk drivers," that's not a person that I look at on the street and say they're a drunk driver.
Right.
But if I said, "Okay, I fear for my safety because, I'm a woman and I'm not safe to walk down the street at night," that is a different, than you have a group of people that you maybe fear. And so we could think of it like that, as sort of the experience of direct violence is important. Um, and normally it's associated with, I'm a victim of violence because I am what, right? So it could be any number of things, but I think that's more what we wanna get at, not random acts of violence.
Okay.
Um,
So and so it's the idea of diluting some of the social trends down to groups, ethnic groups, gender-based groups, age, religion that are directly connected to safety.
yeah, and how people feel safe, most importantly.
Mm,
So,
mhm.
that would also be a great example of, I might get into a car, but drunk driving, I might not think, "Okay, I feel less safe as a human being today
Right.
because there are drunk drivers on the road." If that was actually a really major aspect of my existence, then maybe it would matter, but for most people, it's not what they think of, as their, primary sort of experience with violence. There's a lot of other things that people think about.
Okay.
So that's one. Um, Another is
Adrienne, I'm so sorry.
how
Before we move
okay.
on, because I really do want to make sure that we're creating a foundation for anyone to use your playbook on this,
Yeah.
can I push harder and can you help me define what feeling safe actually means? Because I think when I think about Americans, it seems like some people are crafting stories about where
Mm.
their risk might be. Not to say that it's a non-zero, it's a non-zero risk, but I'm concerned that some people are fabricating for the sake of their arguments. And also, like, if I say where my lack of safety is, I have no idea if that's true or not.
Yeah, okay, great question. So we actually look at both the reality, let's put it that way, the reality, the
Yeah.
measure of, are people dying from violence at a greater extent than they were 6 months ago, or are people injured or attacked more often than they were 6 months ago? Things like that, which I would put into one category. And we also look at whether people feel safe or they feel like victims. We do both because when you think about conflict, whether people are actually, experiencing violence at a higher level doesn't necessarily translate to whether that experience of violence in their head will then,
Right.
create an
Trigger.
acceptability for a
Correct.
certain conflict or a certain and for things to escalate.
Right.
So we look at actually both of those, not just the sort of what some people might call like the objective experience, right? Did this happen or did it not? You can sort of confirm. We also look at people's perceptions of that.
And then I imagine that is where your research has centered when it comes to like groupthink and in-group fighting or in-group defense. And I know the algorithms are doing numbers on
Yeah.
people's mental stability and the in-grouping. I'm really tormented by what I'm seeing on social media in terms of the them versus usness. Um, but that makes a ton of sense. So I appreciate you defining feeling because it's so clear that if I feel a certain way, whether or not it's reality or not, it could trigger a behavior and additional copycat behaviors from people who might have the same lived experience or voluntarily agree with my perspectives. So the feeling thing is probably very hard to quantify too. How do you do that? If I said I, as a Jewish American woman, feel less safe, how do you quantify that?
Yeah, well, we use survey measures and we ask people actually, do you feel safe? Do you feel safe walking in the area where you live at night? Do you feel safe? And we might add certain circumstances that are based on the context that we're trying to study. So, but I think that this point is really important that one of the things when I was doing my work in Burundi that I learned about the Rwandan genocide was that, one of the biggest misconceptions is that people think, okay, hate is the biggest motivator and something like that. It
Mm.
just feels like such a visceral moment. It's actually fear. And so when you think about like, well, then what is driving fear? That kind of allows you to think about what kind of questions would I put together to ask somebody about their experience around violence, around their own sense of power, around, different themes. I can go through that, but that's what,
Please
that's what.
do, if you don't mind, because that
Sure.
really, I like felt that through my chest bone. Um,
Yeah, so we look at that sort of physical aspect, right? The violence, the sort of personal "am I safe?" question. We also look at whether people feel they have power to change things that they care about the most. People who tend to feel very disempowered or feel like there aren't avenues for them to take action that are healthy will often move towards unhealthy avenues for dealing with the problems that they see. And so we do look a lot at what sense of agency do people have? Do they feel that they can take action in a way that they also can be safe? Um, we all Third, we look at this question of polarization. So um, I would define that as whether people not whether people like each other, but whether they trust each other to live together. So you're really looking at breaking it down, different identity groups. A Jewish American woman, for example, you might look at gender, religious identity, ethnic identity, etc., to try to understand who feels that they can share this society with everybody else and who feels that they're being threatened by another group. And how strong is that sense of threat? How strong is that fear of another group? So we look at those 3, and then the last thing that we look at is trust in institutions. And if people don't trust institutions to support them in this collective experiment of, living in a society together,
existing, right.
that really breaks down. If you don't think that you can go to the voting booth, you have to find another way. If you don't think that if you don't think that you can get basic services
Mhm.
that you need to survive, you may start looking for who does provide those services.
Right,
And oftentimes there are a lot of groups that profit off of that
right.
dynamic. So yeah, we look at all those elements, and then we track what I mentioned earlier, which is are people investing in peace or are they investing more in violence? Violent means like war, arms, etc. So those give us a sense of where the trends are going.
Okay. A couple of things just for our table set. Um, I'm a Jewish American woman that feels perfectly safe. So I use that as an example. I do not share the same level of fear that some of my some of the other people that share the same identity as I do. I see the rise in Jewish hate, but it's not something that's keeping me up at night. Probably just because the other headlines are dominating that level of distraughtness. But um, so is it fair to say then, if and I haven't heard this idea around fear versus hate
Mhm.
as being the catalyst for atrocities, violence, genocide, really before, but it strikes me that um, the myth of fear is the thing that can end up getting weaponized, that it's the story of fear when if the data doesn't necessarily suggest it, or if it gets disproportionately measured, which is like a shitty
Mhm.
thing to do. Like how do you measure whether or not fear is justified? Because I sometimes find, and I was thinking about this is what I think about when I'm by myself. It's so embarrassing and exhausting. I know you're the same way. But I was thinking about femicide, which is
Mhm.
the killing of women globally just because they're women. Like period, full stop. There's been a lot of reporting that has entered my screen from Central and South America, but the leading cause of death for women worldwide, particularly at the hands of domestic violence, is just because they are women. It's known as femicide. And so there's a part of me that's like, well, how do I quantify the fear that women rightfully should have globally? I don't know what I'm trying to say, Adrienne, maybe you can help me, but there is this
Yeah,
idea of like, I do like, how do you quantify fear based on someone's lived experience in El Salvador versus somebody's lived experience in Westchester, New York versus how the headlines are spinning it?
right.
Like, what did
So
you find in Burundi? Maybe like that might be a more nuclear, nuanced example that we can pick
let me
apart.
use the example of Burundi to help us unpack this a little
Great.
bit.
'Cause I'm
So
asking, like, what I feel like is the hardest questions at the root of, like, the United Nations and how we're going to all share the same electrical grid for the next 300 years.
yeah, I mean, the real important thing to know here, and this is also I think this is where a peace building perspective, kind of with the work that Search does comes into this. Um, you don't have to decide whether it's justified or not. For
What
the
the
purpose
feeling
of
of fear.
the feeling of fear, what you need to understand is how strong it is and how much it's driving decision making and what's going to happen next. And one of the things for me, Burundi had a really had a 15-year, very long war.
Yeah, could you
Uh,
give us all the 101 on Burundi?
it so everyone knows about the Rwandan genocide. The dynamics are similar, but a little bit opposite. The opposite group was in power. You had some things that were different. What was happening is that these 2 countries were also very close by to each other and could see the dynamics of each other. So oftentimes, you know, you would see that if there was a massacre in one country, not too long after, there would be a massacre in the other against the other group. There was this kind of continuous cycle that was happening. And in 1993, the president in Burundi was assassinated, and that kind of kickstarted a really long, very long, drawn out war, killed over 300,000 people. So it's very large scale. It's less well known. The details are less well known than Rwanda, typically. What is important to know about that is that that conflict, also kind of continued and has, the countries face a lot of challenges even since the end of the kind of official end of the war. in
Adrienne, can may I
2005.
interrupt you because someone just offered an important comment in chat. They said
Sure.
that because Twitch is a slightly younger demographic, they might not be as fluent even on the Rwandan
Oh, good point.
genocide.
Okay,
So,
fair
if you
enough.
wouldn't mind even getting more basic than where
Okay,
you were.
so in
We're talking
in
about 2 countries on
good
the
point.
continent of Africa.
Yes, exactly. So in
Thanks, Jay.
Central East Africa, yeah, thank you for that comment. In Central East Africa, 1993 and 1994, Rwanda had a genocide that occurred in 1994 and Burundi in 1993. Rwanda's genocide was uh, over 500,000 people killed within the first 2 weeks, like extremely, extremely violent and extremely fast moving.
And it was
Um,
between the Hutu and the
Hutu
Tutsis.
and Tutsi. Um, and so in Burundi, in Rwanda, you had the Hutu group that was in power, and the genocide was against the Tutsi. In Burundi, it was the opposite. That there was a Hutu president, but he was killed, and then the Tutsi historically had been in power for decades before that, and so you had a different sort of dynamic in that country, of political power and everything. So, um, what's interesting about both of these countries and the history, I won't get too, I won't dive too deep into it, but what's really important to understand is that the narratives that were crafted to shape what people saw as reality were intense and all consuming. People didn't see, "Oh, I can don't worry, I can still reach out to the other side," and, this was a moment where it was actually built on decades of violence prior to that, and, very large cycles of violence that really made things quite concrete for people. So this question of who was right to fear, you can ask it, and somebody could answer. But I think if you wanna find an end to that cycle, it's important to actually understand with almost radical levels of empathy what people fear and how it's real to them and how that shapes the everyday person. Most people don't, you know, they don't just love war. It takes a lot of money and time and effort to make people think that that's the only way through. And so that's kind of, that's what we look at when I say, we're looking at people's sense of fear, their sense of safety, their sense of, trust and all of that. It's just as real to them as any other measure that you could think of. And it's just as and it might even be more of a reason, of a reason for them to support or not support violence in the future. And so that's why we look at those elements because they really do have, if you think of, I don't know, you think of yourself, I think of myself if I'm walking down a street and if I feel afraid, I'm like putting the keys between my, I'm like, what can I do? I'm ready to, I'm almost ready to fight and there's nobody there.
Hmm.
But if I feel like I'm not safe, that really shapes how people are ready to make decisions. So that's why we look at that.
Would you mind offering like some nuanced, concrete examples to specifically what the Hutu and the Tutsi, what their different perspectives were of each other,
Mm.
either in Rwanda and then how different in Burundi, or just focus on Burundi as an example?
Yeah, I can focus on Burundi because that's where I did my research. I mean,
Great.
might be easier. So there were 2 things to think about. There was the perception of the other and also the perception of self. And narratives play a massive role in not just, who is the other group, what are they to me, but also who am I? And so when I did interviews with people in Burundi who fought in the war, for example, many of them talked about the importance of these sort of stories or things they would tell themselves, things that people would tell them about what it really means to be Hutu. And that means to stand up for yourself. It means not to give up. It means, all of these things. And so, there was a huge amount of effort around making those links to who am I and giving people a group they can be part of.
Hmm.
And I think that this then dovetails to who were the Tutsi in that situation. Well, they were narrated as the group of people who kept them from being able to stand up, who kept them from being able to be
Because
counted.
the Tutsi were, the predominant group that was
They
in
were
charge.
in they were in government and in political power for decades before
So
that
it
war.
was, like, systemic, but it was, like, the system's preventing you from doing this, but it was blamed on a specific demographic.
Yes, it was this group of people is profiting from this. This group of people is keeping us down. And, a Tutsi in that moment, well, there were also Tutsi who fought, and they had their own sets of narratives that if they were to give power to that other group, the Hutu, which was a much larger portion of the population than the Tutsi were, um, that they could be massacred, that maybe they wouldn't be safe, that the only way that they're able to keep order in the country is to make sure that they are the ones that are in power, that this group of people can't be trusted. And then there's this irony to it because they Hutus weren't allowed access to things like secondary education, so higher education, roles in the government, etc. And so the fear is also built on a group of people who are uneducated, who cannot, govern, who can't, and and maybe there's a tiny grain of truth, but the conclusion is not about.
It's not sweeping.
Well, the conclusion is certainly not sweeping, right? There's plenty of people who even also ended up abroad or other kinds of things. But B, I find this really interesting that oftentimes the best lies are told with a grain of truth, right? So you have a grain of truth, which is like the population didn't have access to education and they don't necessarily know how government runs in the same way because they weren't part of they didn't get to be part of the government. The conclusion is not keep them out forever. The conclusion is let's figure out a way to make that work. And yet, um, that then kind of fanfared into like, well, we can't let this happen, right? So that's how the war continued and continued, and it took huge negotiation processes over more than a decade to kind of bring it all back together.
So I actually have never physically felt the way that I feel right now, in any of my conversations, be it like on air or even in these spaces. And I'm even trying to like go back to were there any classes in grad school? And I studied international peace development, which was really the study of war. And I can only think of one class when we were specifically studying Joseph Kony in Uganda, where I felt
Mhm.
the exact way that I feel right now, that I feel sick and I feel nauseous. I um there is something that is hitting so close to home on this. Um uh that is hitting so close to home, and somebody else in the chat referenced that as well. Um but can I ask a couple of clarifying questions, because I do really feel like we need to pull this out and make sure that this is like broadcast far and wide. When the uh and I'm embarrassed because I'm scared I'm going to mess up the Hutu and the Tutsi, because I know it's opposite in Rwanda and that it is in Burundi. But when um, the Tutsi were concerned about the Hutu gaining more power, and that grain of truth of like, well, some of them can't perform brain surgery because they haven't been trained, whatever it might be. And you had mentioned that the Tutsi were concerned that they would get massacred, that they would feel unsafe. Had there been decades, had there been history of those two groups being violent toward each other? I'm selfishly asking because as I think about the United States and what's to come, And now I very clearly understand why Search for Common Ground has built offices here in the US. But like, I'm not sure I could successfully us them, and I don't know the us that I'm part of or the them that I'm not part of, but I can sort of see the crowds forming. I can sort of see the groups forming and feels very much committed. I could do it based on politics and the news that folks are watching. But had there been violence between those two groups prior to 1990, we'll say, like, where did the
Yes.
unsafety feel, or the massacre, use that term, which is something I would never use to describe anything here.
Yes. So there had been. Um, there were these kind of waves, and they were almost every 20, 25 years that you would have these really notable massacres or moments of really widespread violence, often around, maybe Hutus uprising,
Mm.
trying again to gain more access to government and political power and freedom, and then that being shut down very hard, very violently. Um, but it goes, to understand it, I think there's these waves that go like this, but to understand it well and to think about the situation in the US, it wasn't always Hutu Tutsi, actually. Um, there were actually three groups or even more before that. And it was through colonization that these narratives became really stuck in a certain way. The definition of a Hutu or a Tutsi it was different. It was still, I would say it was still a bit sticky. It's not something you could say, tomorrow I want to be Tutsi and I'm going to be Tutsi. But so it was related to, roles in society and different sort of classes, but there was a fluidity to it and it was very decentralized. So, as you're thinking about the United States, think about the fact that it takes actually decades to craft narratives that have such a strong meaning. Think about the fact that it takes a lot of money and resources, honestly, to do that as well. And so somebody needs to be doing it on purpose. And so when we think about ourselves and we think about us as fundamentally different from someone else, or I really don't share anything with that person, and you just close your eyes and you think, who do I not share anything with in a place like the United States? Who do I feel most different from? I think the question you have to ask yourself is who profits from that narrative and who's crafting it and why? Because we're not actually designed to
Believe
that.
that.
Yeah, we're designed to think about our community. We're designed in some ways, yeah, there are psychological elements to this that work in their favor, right? It's easy for us to need a group and then need the people who aren't in that group. But there's nothing inherent about those groups. They're all sort of made and constructed, and the narratives we tell ourselves and that we're told help create that reality for us. And that's, very much the experience in Burundi during the war.
Who was profiting off of that narrative? I can make the assumption post-colonialization, but, like, who was profiting off of that narrative in the 90s?
Well, yeah. So in the 60s, it was when as the Belgians left, there's actual kind of documentation of the Belgians saying, well, like, we'll put this group in power and
The
that group.
friendlies in power,
Yeah,
right.
yeah, we'll put the friendlies in power. And so um they put different groups in power in Rwanda and Burundi in political power, but, the dynamics were quite similar. If you go back even further, the Germans also profited off of that narrative and, constructed quite a lot of extreme violence between the groups in the 20s. So this was, coming. And then as you go into the 90s, what's interesting is people wanted democracy.
Mm.
So in terms of the outside world, everyone thought democracy was a really great thing. And I think the which group is in power and who and how mattered a little less. The tactics were different. Um, So the transition that happened was really fast from a Tutsi government to a Hutu uh, a Hutu-led government, and it just was nobody actually knows for sure who started the war. If it was the military, I think people think it was the Tutsi-led military. Um, but yeah, it just he was assassinated. Members of the government were assassinated, and that kind of kicked it off. But by that time, it's almost too late to ask the question, "Who's
Correct.
profiting?"
Yeah.
You've got the who's been profiting off of that system. Um, a lot of external governments that wanted control over resources and
Right.
economic flows. You know, yeah.
So this is where I get like, ah, damn it, those conspiracies sometimes, where there's smoke, there's fire. Like if I think about the best interests of the Germans and then the Belgians or just Europeans in general post independence, it is because of the natural resources that exist in that part of the world and just being able to control that kind of land and those people is just
Yeah.
largely helpful. Um, and I hate when people like, "Oh, they're just doing it because they, want a base in the Middle East," or, "Oh, they're just doing it because there's oil fields off the coast," and, whatever the issue where whatever the geography might be, and I hate that I know that there's some truth to that. Um, when I think about or when you look at the world in general, this is a mean thing for me to do to you, but I will anyway, is
Nice.
where else besides the United States do you see this kind of polarization starting to brew where you all have eyes on it 3, 5, 7 years ahead of the
Mm.
headlines?
Okay, great question. So, globally right now, polarization is on the rise in every continent, in every place in the world.
And if you could also add who's profiting off of it in each of those circumstances.
Well, yeah, in the entire world.
Yes.
Um,
We'll go
look,
country by country. No, I'm kidding.
I think it's not I think it's a question of profit, and I think it's also a question of, sometimes we think of governments like they're, marionettes, like orchestrating
Right.
something. They're actually also products of their own of everything
System.
too.
Right.
It's like this people.
Yes.
So, these things interact a little bit. So I just wanna put that as, like, a little caveat that, part of it is profit and positioning and all of that, and part of it is also really complex, beliefs and understandings of the world playing out at a policy level. Um, so when I say that everywhere in the world right now, how polarization is increasing, we are seeing, um yeah, we're seeing a rise in certain governing styles, um, that are really putting a question mark on democracy. I think for what I was just saying, like in the '90s, everyone was like, "Great, democracy is good. Let's all move towards that." And now, actually, that's being questioned, not just in any one nation, but you see these trends
Globally.
all over the world globally. Now, who profits from that? Groups that are able to be in power. But you said something earlier that I actually think is also a really important aspect of this. Companies that are tech companies profit quite a lot from this polarization. And so for me, it's not a coincidence that we're seeing this rise globally because many algorithms on social media are designed for us to almost gravitate towards things that are polarizing. It helps them, just it's not about wanting polarization, it's about polarization psychologically affecting people in a way that makes them click more. So it makes
Mhm.
it makes certain groups more money when you're angry. It makes certain groups more money when you're frustrated, feeling helpless. It makes them more money when you're mad at someone else or when you don't know what to trust. And that's actually just it's not something I would say. I mean, it's really well documented, right? We kind of know this about things like Instagram and Facebook and how it's actually hard for the algorithm to work a different way because it just makes so much money for people that, to see polarizing content.
And if I could
So
offer like an additional nuanced example, I spend a lot of time both watching or mostly watching and consuming right-leaning
mm,
media outlets in the states just because I'm so interested in consuming all of the things and understanding where what the narratives might be. And when I say I sincerely believe that one of the companies that are profiting the most from this is whatever that crazy guy is who was Trump's sidekick who developed the, like, pillow. What's his name? Michael something, where, like, he was the random guy. I know Jay's gonna drop it. Um, he was the random guy who developed, like, the magical pillow and then the magical
oh, yeah.
slippers, and then, thank you. The My Pillow guy, right, and admittedly, I really appreciate that Go Bird 76 and Go Birds, but I've every time it is on probably that commercial runs, like, 3 or 4 times every 30 minutes. I mean, it is an extraordinary amount of time, and the guy, Michael, because he's Trump's sidekick, like, Trump has equity in the pillow company. Like, it's not it's, like, crazy. I feel crazy even saying this, but it's like, it's a pillow guy is profiting from it, and Big Pharma, mesothelioma is the
Mm.
pharmaceutical company that treats mesothelioma. Like, I can say that word so eloquently because I watch CNN a lot, and that's the biggest commercial. Like, it's not even to your point of, like, there's some couple of companies that are puppeteering the whole thing. It's like randoms. It's like random people that are profiting from it and keeping the machine going.
Yes, and it can be just about profit for profit's sake.
Right,
It's not that someone's like, "I really, really hope that, um, a conflict in Myanmar breaks out and becomes uncontrollable." It's just a matter of wanting to sell ads, and what
right,
sells the most ads, and the
right,
algorithm is
right,
like, "Well, this gets a lot of engagement," right?
right,
So
right, and
so
if you have
so
the breaking news and the chyron of every night, not just when there's breaking news, people will stay on, and as you said, like, I didn't appreciate how you've articulated fear, but fear after 9/11 felt like we were really trading in it, but now it feels so much
Mhm.
more insidious and so much more sophisticated.
Well, the good news is that I think when you take a look at this and you pay attention to it in a systematic way and you're serious about it, you can also tell the warning signs, and there are places where, even our own teams have been able to work with. You brought up femicide earlier, and I think one of the places that you actually see a lot of violence against women is online, and you can see the links between their experience of actual violence and how that rises and falls online. And in Sri Lanka, they actually worked with, groups like Meta and other groups that were, where social media platforms that are really popular, to say, let's track this and let's also put in the right mechanisms to deal with it. And Meta is not like, I mean, it's a company with thousands of people, right? So they're not, again, most people don't want, femicide to happen. so
Right,
so
right.
you offer these things. We actually can diagnose and we can treat some of these things. And I guess that's like the hopeful part of this, is when you know what you're talking about and you can see it coming, you also can say, here are 5 things that you can do different to keep that from getting out of control.
Adrienne, how do you catch your own fear? I know you, and I appreciate that you mentioned earlier in the conversation, like, it actually doesn't matter. If you're afraid, and we don't need to quantify it, and we don't need to
Mhm.
subjectify it. We just need to meet you where you are. Um, if I think about some of the my peers here in the States that their fear is impacting what I see happening elsewhere in the world, like do you actively work to catch your own biases and be like, that's just my mind. That's just a narrative that might not be like, are you sure? Are you sure? Is the thing I keep asking
Yeah.
myself. In my hypotheses,
So,
like you're an expert on catching biases and blind spots. What do you do personally?
um, I do. So I do. Yeah. I guess it's the short answer. I
I
do.
feel so bad. I should have like handed you a glass of wine as you said that. Sorry.
No, I mean, I have a couple of ways of thinking. I'll actually give like a personal example of this. When my own background, my mom is from Haiti. My dad grew up in Florida. So, and he's white. He's like the sort of red curly hair, blue eyes, freckled face white. So it's sort of like two very different experiences of my own, built in my own family growing up. And something really touched for me a nerve with the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, where I really felt it like very deeply. That's my own experience, my own thing. And I remember talking, but I grew up in South Carolina, right? So I knew a lot of people who didn't share the visceral feeling that I had, seeing sort of images of people being murdered or, it's kind of the news that was coming out. Um, and there was a point where I almost like froze. I didn't know what to do. How do I you know, how do how do I deal with all of this? And I wanted to kind of disengage from it all. It felt painful and hard. And I think that there was an element of not trusting people. At some point you just fear being hurt, even from discussing it. You just like don't want to engage. Um, and that's okay. First of all, I want to say like sometimes you're in that space and it's just time for you to take a break. But my job, that's not my job. So so I needed to figure out like how do I get out of that and how do I examine it a little bit. And so I talked to people. I spent a lot of time actually getting off of Facebook and saying, why don't we have a phone call with people that I disagreed with 100%. Just people I grew up with or whatever, people I knew, maybe I could just reach out on that one little thread of trust of like, I know this person. I'm gonna be okay at the end of this, even if it's a really hard conversation.
Mm.
How do I sort of pull myself back into this? Um, and it was, I found it really interesting. I actually learned a lot of things from people who, like were police officers, and were saying, here's what you need to understand about X, Y, and Z. And it was a lot of question asking and a lot of honesty. So never shying away from this is how I see it. There's something some Ta-Nehisi Coates actually said this. I think he was saying it in an interview at some point. I don't remember. It's like I saw a clip and it really just touched me where he said like if you can't give someone your honesty basically, like your honest opinion, your honest point of view, you're essentially assuming that that person doesn't have the ability to engage with you. You're already writing them off before you get started. Um, so I say like, okay, I can't do that with everybody. That's energy that I don't have. Maybe I can do it with one or two people, but really do it. Like really just I need, you label it. This is going to be a hard conversation. It's hard for me, it's hard for you. Let's get into it anyway. And be ready for that. And I think that sort of allows me sometimes and I still try to employ that in other ways, right? Like I'm a leader at search and sometimes I maybe have bias or I'm not seeing someone's potential or I'm not seeing, and it's important to check that. And so I think being able to like name it for yourself, name a space where you can engage with it, a person that you can develop enough trust or enough vulnerability with that you can start to open that up, that's what sort of allowed me, to do that over time on a myriad of different things. But that's just one example for me that was, like, very I remember having a moment where I really had to decide, like, "Okay, I'm gonna get back into this." You know, so,
Thank you for sharing that.
yeah.
May I ask a follow-up question?
Sure, anything.
What was one thing that you learned from the police officer that was surprising to you?
Hmm. He said, one of the questions that kept coming up was like, why, maybe I can't remember at which point it came up, but it was why would you shoot to kill? Like, why don't you just shoot somebody in the leg or shoot somebody in the arm? And
The knee, that's always where I'm like, "Why didn't you
yeah,
just"
yeah, yeah, the knee,
Yeah,
whatever it is. And he said, well, if you're using a gun, you always shoot to kill. And for me, I was like, "Wait a minute. What? Like, that doesn't make sense." And he said, "No, if it gets to the point where you need to pull your gun out, that is what you're doing. You're not supposed to let it get to the point where you pull like, it shouldn't the question is not, do you shoot to kill? It's, do you pull the gun out?" And,
and
that
if you make the
that
decision
shaped
to pull the gun out, there's only one target.
like, you shouldn't be using a weapon that's designed to kill for any other purpose. It's not you're not supposed to be, like, permanently maiming somebody instead of killing them. You're
Right.
supposed to stop them. And so the only thing that I should say you shoot to stop. Let's put it that way. It's not that killing is the goal, but you shoot to stop. And and so you're shooting not for somebody to keep running at you or, possibly even have an adrenaline rush and things to get worse, but you're actually shooting to stop them at that point. And the line of when you pull your gun out is supposed to be, is this person, now a threat to my life or the threat to the life of others? And so that really reshaped my understanding of, the psychology of it a little bit. Is that okay? So it's not,
If
I
that
always
was your
thought,
lesson, if that was your training, and I see Jay offering that her dad was also, a police officer, and that's how they're trained, like, did they train them
"Mhm."
like that because they had to scale training quickly? And, like, the psychology of training Adrienne versus Jenna on, like, how to navigate nuance in those kinds of moments would look different, and you can't handhold every trainee.
Well, I think now, there's that conversation about, does every situation need a police officer?
Right.
Does every, and I think that's a really interesting and valid and
Uh-huh.
nuanced one, which is the right conversation to be having. So I guess that's what I realized, is that there are these things that become narratives once again, like, become narratives, like, why would this guy not pull his gun out and just shoot the guy's hand or shoot the guy's knee or something else? And really the odds of you accurately shooting, or me or a police officer accurately shooting someone's knee as they're running towards you, is very little. So the question shouldn't be like, why didn't you shoot to kill? It should be, did you need to pull the gun out in the first place?
Yeah.
And is what situations merit that and don't, et cetera. And so, yeah, I appreciated it actually. And there were lots of other things, but that
Yeah.
was just one example of a moment where I was like, oh, I didn't know that
Now
at all.
that connects
Yeah.
some dots for me. Yeah, Adrienne, I really appreciate that example, and I appreciate you, um, going back to May 2020 or the years after that, um, to help us understand how you process your own bias. I mean, that is
Mhm.
where spending time on Twitch, we're intentionally here because we're trying to see if we can find some folks who might not necessarily have the same lived experience or might be asking slightly different questions. And I've learned so much about folks in the comments and the questions that they're asking and sort of our collective shortcomings together. So I appreciate you doing that and using that nuanced example. I often find that all I'm doing is trying to understand how you think the way that you do. And in
Mhm.
being able to understand why, as Jay said, no, when you're pulling out a gun, there's only one objective. It is lethal use. Is like, oh, okay. I can then piece that together and I can then meet or the solution, I'm not part of any defunding the police efforts, although I have very strong opinions about it. And I'm often use the example of like when someone's in labor and you call the police, I don't want someone showing up with a gun. I want a doula showing up. But if someone's robbing a bank, I want a police officer showing up with a gun. But the idea that it's not that there's nuance and exceptions, there's just nuance and clarity. And in order for us to get to the solution or what could be some workarounds, we just need to be chasing the clarity. So I really appreciate that. Being really sensitive of your time, Adrienne, because I know it's the evening and you definitely deserve a hefty pour of wine after this conversation. I wanted to talk a little bit, and this is like where we could really geek out. I know that you were responsible within the search team of building out those 5 vital signs of a healthy society, which Schammel uses often, which is the bedrock for searches, flags that are going up around the state of countries and identifying where some of the countries might be at risk. And I still might push you harder and ask you to name countries where polarization really is on the rise that might be risky. But if and maybe if you could run through the 5 vital signs for us, that'd be helpful. Knowing that one of the vital signs is trust in institutions, and whether or not you think that there's some level of reliability in them. When I think of institutions that I engage with, it's people who are deciding what speed limits are, that I can walk into an emergency room and get stitches, that might tax that when I this is the thing that always happens. I get a lot of speeding tickets, hence the reason why I use the speed limit example. Don't ask. I have a bit of a lead foot, but I also think I'm a really good driver. That's not an excuse, but it is what it is. And I just say when my husband's like, another speeding ticket, I'm like, I know, but the money's going to a printer for the second grade classroom down the street or something like that. That like the money that I'm spending is going back to the infrastructure of a country or the world.
Mm.
But if there are systems, if democracy is being called into question and some of our systems aren't working, the way that we've organized things, isn't the world calling into question those systems? And then therefore, isn't that like the bedrock of all of this shaking up? Is democracy really the right route? I mean, I know this is like another
Yeah.
29 PhDs, but see what you can do with
It's
that in our waning.
No, I mean, look, I think of democracy as I think we tend to think of democracy as like a state of being, like a noun. Like we have a democracy, we are a democracy. Um, but you have to continuously create a democracy. It should be like a verb. It's not a verb, but it should be kind of more thought of as a verb, right?
Make democracy a verb.
We're
That's going to
doing
be the
we're
title of this
doing
conversation.
we're doing democracy
Right.
today. I know. So I think, yeah, people are calling question those systems all over the world. It's a sign of things that haven't served groups of people. People have been, ignored or marginalized or not totally included in those systems and the way that we think of them. And this is part of that. This is part of that reaction and part of what's going on. Um, but yeah, I and one of the things that I have noticed is that when we think of democracy, we think of, for example, elections. Everyone's like, "Oh, are we a democracy?" They look at the election. We are or we're not. People will talk about it based on elections, and specifically national level elections. And we forget that there's all of these other ways that democracy comes to life and is protected. And most of that, it's almost like it's like an arc. You get a little comfortable. You still have people who are fighting in that space, making it progress, making it, trying to make it work. But we start to lose a little bit of the control or the attention to all of the very complex pieces that make up that democracy. So, I would say, it's not over. So all those places where democracy is being challenged, right? There's all kinds of ways that we can be organizing and be thinking about what does it mean to become, improve a democracy, or just improve our nation. Who do we need to who has been left behind that we need to be pulling in?
Mhm,
And
mhm,
how do we do that from a stronger space? How do we do that from a place that really pulls people from different backgrounds in and have, create an interest in protecting some of those systems that serve us? Um, Demanding accountability that's going to protect the systems that are meant to serve us, et cetera. So I know that's a very big, broad thing, but I would say yes, it's being challenged, and also it's also not over. I mean, you kind of see that, I'm in France, so we just kind of saw the last year the sort of challenge between far right, far left, who would win, and then a really interesting choice of not none of the above, but rather a new coalition that we didn't think would actually come together in order to protect systems. So, these things can have really different outcomes than you expect, but it has to be continuously, I don't wanna say fought for, worked for, let's say.
yeah, yeah, no, it's like an exercise, it's like a constant plank. I do these terrible things of making analogies. I was, again, driving probably over the speed limit, and I'm like, "Okay, policy is like Botox if elected officials are like makeup." Like, I'm such if democracy is like holding a plank or hot yoga. Um, so a couple do you have a few more minutes for a couple of
Yeah,
clarifying questions? Do you mind? I
sure.
appreciate that. One of the things that I struggle with a little bit, particularly as it applies to the US, and one of our favorite friends, Master Liberty, is here, who will have a lot of, I think, probably US centric um, questions to ask. But you have done so much research on identity, and I would love to talk a little bit about intergenerational memory,
Mm,
but specifically, I don't know if it's intergenerational memory or intergenerational behavior, but I do, one of the things that frustrates me um, a lot about Americans, and I also am not even clear where my own behaviors are, where my blind spots are in this, but this idea of entitlement that like the systems do work for us. So if we like say democracy, well,
mm,
like, like you owe me this. Like my public school teachers owe my kids perfect reading scores. My doctor owes me perfect health. Like the government owes me perfect ABC, whatever it might be. But um like intergenerational memory and inherited trauma, I we could probably have a very long conversation about, but like are there places in the world that you've seen where there is this a broader commitment from community and country to like link arms and invest in it? Because I don't think that Americans want to do democracy. I like largely don't think anyone is interested in doing
mm.
the verb.
Okay,
And I think
yes.
that's an intergenerational
Yeah.
entitlement.
So I was gonna say it's a temporal thing. So, and this
Your
is
lips
a
and goddess's
shared
ears.
yeah, this is actually like a shared struggle in a lot of places. It's not the US is not, unique about in this sense, let's say, that you have it's actually really normal to, for example, look at elections and say, "Oh, are we or aren't we?" We see that kind of all over the world happening. Um, this happens in Kenya, it happened in Mozambique in January, December, where elections are sort of the thing that everyone is paying attention to. And the undercurrent is, why do elections matter so much? Because people are searching for a change, because they're unhappy with many of the institutions that serve them, regardless of who wins. And they're unhappy with the way the system is working for them. So, yeah, I think there are moments in terms of generation. I don't know if it's generation, but yeah, there are moments where certain generations are forced to really do democracy or, they're forced to really reckon with what do we have and how does it serve us and what are we gonna do about it?
Because you're saying former generations, and I'm specifically blaming my parents and my aunts and uncles here, did not ever show up to do anything or barely did.
Mm,
Or things were cruising it's almost like the car was working fine, and now the engine's expired because it doesn't apply anymore, and it's on
yeah.
us to fix.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say in the United States that there are, definitely periods that have been a little less well, I it's interesting. I'm not, and Neelan might have a really interesting take on this. So I don't know what she would say and if we would agree. But for me, one of the interesting challenges of the United States is, 300 million people, more than that. Um, a really long, complex history with 50 governing systems means that the question of, what is this nation and what are we doing is actually different. And people are fighting on different issues or working on different issues in different places across that nation. So I think sometimes that actually also keeps us a little bit what diluted might be the word. You're always gonna have people who are working towards pushing this country in a better direction, whatever they might perceive that to be. How united they feel they can be, what unites them, how that actually comes together, yeah, there are more and less visceral moments for people. And, yeah, I'll try to say it that way. I'm not sure if, yeah, I'm not sure if I'm not sure if it means, our parents' generation or, was completely inactive, but I think they had, different things on their mind and different challenges than we look at today. And there's also more people that have, there's also like a increasingly greater diversity number and type of people who are involved in that conversation. And that's something I also find really interesting. The
Yeah,
question of who's served by our government used to be a much simpler one in 1950.
right.
So, that I think is also a really important aspect to that.
Okay. I have 2 more, questions. Both will have, like, esoteric, broad answers. Um, Again, going back to your, statement about, like, fear is actually at the basis of so much violence and fear around myths and how to quantify them or not quantify them, how you get at them. I spend a lot of time and I do. I live in analogy. It's the only way I process the world. And I'm a mom of 2 young kids, so I will, take a lot of the lessons or the work that I'm doing with my kids and sort of apply it to adults. When my
Mhm.
daughter says like, my brother doesn't like me, blah, 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 blah. Like my response is always like, are you sure? Are you sure? Are you sure? And I find myself asking that of myself when I'm making assumptions. I don't do a great job of it, particularly in like today's headlines or hopefully not next week's, but I do spend a lot of time with like the humility of like, do you actually know what the hell you're talking about? Sometimes that keeps me silent. Sometimes that keeps me on the sidelines in ways that it shouldn't. Um, but that's sort of my note and offering. Um, but if fear is part of what is the catalyst for so much violence. What kind of role do you think revenge and
Mm.
also religion are also playing in today's violence? Because my understanding, particularly of the Abrahamic religions and those people who watch me enough know that I'm real cranky about them. Um, they offer stories around who is and who isn't and do the using and the theming. And
Mm.
I do think that there's a lot of air cover that those stories provide people.
So,
Mhm.
uh, religion is a really big part of people's identity. Even people who don't have religion often have a lot of identifiers about not being religious. And so I think we shouldn't underestimate how much that plays in. Um, it's not just about what religion you are. It's about, again, what story you are told and what story you tell yourself about the significance of being part of that religion. But that often gives people, a really large anchor in terms of who they are, why their family is, all of those questions that we ask ourselves. What are we doing in this world, or even the next? And so, those are really, really very large parts of this. And again, that's also not unique to the United States. That's one of those things that you kind of see all over the world. And that particularly conflicts that are sort of embedded in these types of deep identities are often much harder to shift or change on a short timeline. So that's a hard thing to grapple with. Um, and sorry, you're muted.
Sorry, I was sparing you. I was typing something and I didn't wanna bust your eardrum.
Okay.
So an example that you used, when you were walking down the street and you have your keys between your knuckles and you're afraid, that myth
Yeah.
feels like it's easier to fact check or to run at or to hold you or meet you in that, whereas the religious myths are much harder. And has the
Mhm.
organization, and you're welcome to plead the 5th on this, but has the organization Search for Common Ground or, a lot of peace building organizations that you're familiar with, I feel like they're often dodging the religious subject because it feels like it's untouchable, or it should be
Mhm.
untouchable, or I'm someone who will die on the mountain, so anyone can practice whatever religion they are, but yet we're all suffering the consequences of the rise of extremism across all religions, across all faiths, and I'm often looking to faith-based leaders, and I'm also looking to myself to, like, go get my own, particularly during
Mhm.
2020 in the Black Lives Matter movement, it was very much like white women go get white women. And I find
Mhm.
myself as like a Jewish woman, like, go get your Jewish women, go get people of this demographic, go get people who live in Pennsylvania, go get moms, go get things, the identity variables that I can focus on. But I feel like peace building organizations are sort of like plead the fifth on religion.
So, peace building organizations is a really broad group. And Search doesn't shy away from the religion question, quite the opposite. So, we actually work thinking about those identities quite deeply and saying, well, how do we then build something that we can stand on, but engaging with those narratives that people are told, engaging with those aspects of identity. And religion is one of the most important. If you're looking at a conflict, but you're not looking at religious actors and religious leaders and the role that they can play, not just in a negative sense, but also in a positive sense. They can also be really amazing mobilizers for people to change their opinion. You're not doing your job very well, right? If you're not building an authentic stance that really includes and engages with that. So no, the religion question, what I would say is it's absolutely present. It's very important. It's important to understanding conflict. It's also really important to understanding peace. And you're not gonna get there if you don't engage with that question, you don't engage with some of the leaders, oftentimes that are even not convinced themselves that there's a way forward.
Mhm.
But they're highly influential, right? So for me, and for I know this is true for Search, so I can say it for for the organization, the logic is not to stand only on what feels comfortable. It's to stand on what's going to make a shift, what's really gonna make a change. And if the group that's gonna make the most change is a group of religious actors that right now you don't seem to be aligned with at all, it might be time to start looking at how do we engage them? What's the first step? Even if it's the tiniest first step, like what do I need to do? Um, I know we used to work, for example, in Jerusalem with the groups of religious leaders that I mean, I was, I was supporting understanding the impact of this work, and I remember just the 2 steps forward, 4 steps back, 1 step forward, 5 steps back kind of process that was happening over years to build credibility and to imagine something a little bit different with a group of religious actors, and they didn't start only with their, best friends. And I think that's actually really an important thing. If you wanna change the narrative, you have to change the narrative. You can't just, like, create an alternative to the side and hope that people gravitate towards it. So you have to think about who has credibility with people who are at risk of really believing violence might be the only way, and how do we pull them together on something, even if it's the smallest starting point? How do we begin to change the trajectory, so that in 20 years, you're not seeing, something you can't come back from?
Dr. Adrienne Lemon, thank you so much for taking the time. I would love to have you back on. And then I am going to ask you again, where in the
Yeah.
world? Where in the world? So come with your Google spreadsheet and we'll share screen. Um,
Yes.
where in the world your search is focusing on that the rest of the world might not be yet. I will say that that if there's any organization to follow, the best practices that Search for Common Ground has surfaced, thanks so much to your work and thoughtfulness, and humility and grace with yourself, is literally a beacon of hope, at least for me. And I know everyone I'm introducing to the organization feels the same way. Um, and yes, when you come back on, I would like to hear some more thoughts on trust and fear. And it's almost like what you're saying is the only way through all of this is if we confront our own humanity and be gentle with ourselves as we're scared, rationally or not, trusting ourselves and institutions, whether or not they deserve it or not, and our collective commitment to verb democracy. But until then, I really appreciate it and have a lovely evening.
Thank you so much, Jenna. It was